Chapter 43 of Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Terence Callan. Chapter 43 The Unknown. A few days before that on which Philip arrived at Monkshaven, Kester had come to pay Sylvia a visit. As the earliest friend she had, and also as one who knew the real secrets of her life, Sylvia always gave him the warm welcome, the cordial words, and the sweet looks in which the old man delighted. He had a sort of delicacy of his own, which kept him from going to see her too often, even when he was stationary at Monkshaven, but he looked forward to the times when he allowed himself this pleasure, as a child at school looks forward to its holidays. The time of his service at Haytersbank had, on the whole, been the happiest in all his long, monotonous years of daily labor. Sylvia's father had always treated him with the rough kindness of fellowship. Sylvia's mother had never stinted him in his meat, or grudged him his share of the best that was going. And once, when he was ill for a few days in the loft above the cow-house, she had made him possets and nursed him with the same tenderness which he remembered his mother showing to him when he was a little child, but which he had never experienced since then. He had known Sylvia herself as bud and sweet promise of blossom, and just as she was opening into the full-blown rose, and if she had been happy and prosperous, might have passed out of the narrow circle of Kester's interests. One sorrow after another came down upon her pretty innocent head, and Kester's period of service to Daniel Robson, her father, was tragically cut short. All this made Sylvia the great center of the faithful herdsman's affection, and Bella, who reminded him of what Sylvia was when first Kester knew her, only occupied the second place in his heart, although to the child he was much more demonstrative of his regard than to the mother. He had dressed himself in his Sunday best, and although it was only Thursday, had forestalled his Saturday's shaving. He had provided himself with a paper of humbugs for the child, humbugs being the North Country term for certain lumps of toffee, well flavored with peppermint, and now he sat in the accustomed chair, as near to the door as might be, in Sylvia's presence, coaxing the little one, who was not quite sure of his identity, to come to him, by opening the paper parcel and letting its sweet contents be seen. "She's like thee, and yet she favors her feyther," said he, and the moment he had uttered the incautious words, he looked up to see how Sylvia had taken the unpremeditated, unusual reference to her husband. His stealthy glance did not meet her eye, but though he thought she had colored a little, she did not seem offended as he had feared. It was true that Bella had her father's grave, thoughtful, dark eyes, instead of her mother's gray ones, out of which the childlike expression of wonder would never entirely pass away. And as Bella slowly and half distrustfully made her way towards the temptation offered her, she looked at Kester with just her father's look. Sylvia said nothing in direct reply. Kester almost thought she could not have heard him, but by and by she said, "You'll have heard how Kinraid, who's a captain now and a grand officer, has gone and got married." "Nay," said Kester, in genuine surprise, "he niver has, for sure." "Aye, but he has," said Sylvia, "and I'm sure I dunnot see why he shouldn't." "Well, well," said Kester, not looking up at her, for he caught the inflections in the tones of her voice. "He were a fine stirrin' chap, yon, and he were allays for doin' summat, and when he fund as he couldn't have one thing as he'd set his mind on, I reckon he thought he mun put up wi' another." "It'd be no putting up," said Sylvia. "She were staying at Bessie Dawson's, and she come here to see me. She's as pretty a young lady as you'd see on a summer's day, and a real lady too, wi' a fortune. She didn't speak 2 words without bringing in her husband's name. the captain, as she called him. "And she come to see thee?" said Kester, cocking his eye at Sylvia with the old shrewd look. "That were summat queer, weren't it?" Sylvia reddened a good deal. "He's too fause to have spoken to her on me in t'old way, as he used for to speak to me. I were not to her but Philip's wife." "And what to dickens had she to do with Philip?" asked Kester in intense surprise, and so absorbed in curiosity that he let the humbugs all fall out of the paper upon the floor, and the little Bella sat down plump in the midst of treasures as great as those fabled to exist on Tom Tiddler's ground. Sylvia was again silent, but Kester, knowing her well, was sure that she was struggling to speak, and bided his time without repeating his question. "She said, and I think her tale were true, though I cannot get to rights on it, think on it as I will, as Philip saved her husband's life somewhere nearabouts to Jerusalem. She would have it that the captain, for I think I'll niver ca' him Kinraid again, was in a great battle, and were near upon being shot by t' French, when Philip, our Philip, come up and went right into t' fire o' t' guns, and saved her husband's life. And she spoke as if both she and t' captain were more beholden to Philip than words could tell, and she come to see me to try and get news on him." "It's a queer kind of story," said Kester meditatively. "I should have thought as Philip were more likely to have given him a shove into to thick on it than to help him out of t' scrape." "Nay," said Sylvia, suddenly looking straight at Kester, "you're out there. Philip had a deal of good in him, and I dunnot think as he'd have gone and married another woman so soon if he'd been in Kinraid's place." "And you've niver heerd on Philip sin' he left?" asked Kester after a while. "Niver, not but what she told me. And she said that t' captain made inquiry for him right and left, as soon after that happened as might be, and could hear niver a word about him. No one had seen him or knowed his name." "You never heerd of his going for to be a soldier?" persevered Kester. "Niver, I've told you once. It were unlike Philip to think o' such a thing." "But thou mun have been thinking on him at times in all these years, bad as he'd behaved hissel, he were to feyther o' thy little one. What did to think he had been agate on when he left here?" "I didn't know. I were noan so keen a thinking on him at first. I tried to put him out of my thoughts altogether, for it made me like mad to think how he'd stood between me and that other. But I'd begun to wonder and to wonder about him, and to think I should like to hear as he were doing well. I reckon I thought he were in London, where he'd been that time afore, you know, and had allays spoke as if he'd enjoyed hissel tolerable. And then Molly Brunton told me on t'other one's marriage, and somehow it gave me a shake in my heart, and I began for to wish I hadn't said all them words in my passion. And then that fine young lady came with her story, and I've thought a deal on it since, and my mind has come out clear. Philip's dead, and it were his spirit as come to others' help in his time o' need. I've heard feyther say as spirits cannot rest in their graves for trying to undo to wrongs they've done in their bodies." "Them's my conclusions," said Kester solemnly. "I was fain for to hear what were your judgments first, but them's the conclusions I come to as soon as I heard t' tale." "Let alone that one thing," said Sylvia, "he were a kind, good man." "It were a big deal on a one thing, though," said Kester. "It just spoilt your life, my poor lass, and might have gone near to spoiling Charlie Kinraid's too." "Men takes a deal more nor women to spoil their lives," said Sylvia bitterly. "Not a mac o' men, I reckon, lass. Philip's life were pretty well on for being spoilt at after he left here, and it were maybe a good thing he got rid on it so soon." "I wish I'd just had a few kind words wi' him, I do," said Sylvia, almost on the point of crying. "Come, lass, it's as ill moaning after what's past as it'd be for me to fill my eyes wi' weeping after t' humbugs as this little wench o' thine has grubbed up whilst we've been talking. Why, there's not one on 'em left." "She's a sad, spoilt little puss," said Sylvia, holding out her arms to the child, who ran into them and began patting her mother's cheeks and pulling at the soft brown curls tucked away beneath the matronly cap. "Mammy spoils her, and Hester spoils her." "Granny Rose doesn't spoil me," said the child, with quick, intelligent discrimination, interrupting her mother's list. "No, but Jeremiah Foster does above a bit. He'll come in fro to bank, Kester, and ask for her almost every day, and he'll bring her things in his pocket, and she's so fause, she allus goes straight to peep in, and then he shifts to apple or to toy into another. But she's a little fause one," half devouring the child with her kisses, "and he comes and takes her a walk oftentimes, and he goes as slow as if he were quite an old man, to keep pace with Bella's steps. I often run upstairs and watch him out at the window. He doesn't care to have me with him. He's so fain to have the child all to hisself." "She's a bonny un for sure," said Kester, "but not so pretty as thou was, Sylvie. I've niver telled thee what I come for, though, and it's about time for me to be going. I'm off to Cheviot's tomorrow morn to fetch home some sheep as Jonas Blundell has purchased. It'll be a job of better nor 2 months, I reckon." "It'll be a nice time of year," said Sylvia, a little surprised at Kester's evident discouragement at the prospect of the journey or absence. He had often been away from Monkshaven for a longer time, without seeming to care so much about it. "Well, you see, it's a bit hard upon me for to leave my sister, she as is to widow woman, where I put up when I'm at home. Things is main and dear. 4-pound loaves is at 16 pence, and there's a deal of talk on a famine into land, and whatten I paid for my victual and to bed into lean-to helped the old woman a bit, and she's sadly down into mouth, for she cannot hear on a lodger for to tak my place, for all she's moved over to other side of t' bridge for to be nearer to new buildings and to grand new walk they're makin' round t' cliffs, thinking she'd be likelier to pick up a labourer as would be glad on a bed near his work. I'd a like to ha' set her agate wi' a sponsible lodger afore I'd a left, for she's just so soft-hearted, any scamp may put upon her if he nobbut gets haud on her blind side." "Can I help her?" said Sylvia, in her eager way. "I should be so glad, and I've a deal of money by me." "Nay, my lass," said Kester, "thou munnot go off so fast. It were just what I were feared on in telling thee. I've left her a bit of money, and I'll mak shift to send her more. It's just a kind word to keep up her heart when I'm gone, as I want. If thou'd step in and see her from time to time, and cheer her up a bit with talking to her on me, I'd tak it very kind, and I'd go off wi' a lighter heart." "Then I'm sure I'll do it for you, Kester. I niver justly feel like mysel when you're away, for I'm lonesome enough at times. She and I will talk all to better about you, for both on us grieving after you." So Kester took his leave, his mind set at ease by Sylvia's promise to go and see his sister pretty often during his absence in the north. But Sylvia's habits were changed since she, as a girl at Haytersbank, liked to spend half her time in the open air, running out perpetually without anything on, to scatter crumbs to the poultry, or to take a piece of bread to the old cart-horse, to go up to the garden for a handful of herbs, or to clamber to the highest point around to blow the horn which summoned her father and Kester home to dinner. Living in a town where it was necessary to put on hat and cloak before going out into the street, and then to walk in a steady and decorous fashion, she had only cared to escape down to the freedom of the seashore until Philip went away, and after that time she had learnt so to fear observation as a deserted wife that nothing but Bella's health would have been a sufficient motive to take her out of doors. And as she had told Kester, the necessity of giving the little girl a daily walk was very much lightened by the great love and affection which Jeremiah Foster now bore to the child. Ever since the day when the baby had come to his knee, allured by the temptation of his watch, he had apparently considered her as in some sort belonging to him, and now he had almost come to think that he had a right to claim her as his companion in his walk back from the bank to his early dinner, where a high chair was always placed ready for the chance of her coming to share his meal. On these occasions he generally brought her back to the shop door when he returned to his afternoon's work at the bank. Sometimes, however, he would leave word that she was to be sent for from his house in the new town, as his business at the bank for that day was ended. Then Sylvia was compelled to put on her things and fetch back her darling, and excepting for this errand, she seldom went out at all on weekdays. About a fortnight after Kester's farewell call, this need for her visit to Jeremiah Foster's arose, and it seemed to Sylvia that there could not be a better opportunity of fulfilling her promise and going to see the widow Dobson, whose cottage was on the other side of the river, low down on the cliff-side, just at the bend and rush of the full stream into the open sea. She set off pretty early in order to go there first. She found the widow with her house-place tidied up after the midday meal, and busy knitting at the open door, not looking at her rapid-clicking needles, but gazing at the rush and recession of the waves before her, yet not seeing them either, rather seeing days long past. She started into active civility as soon as she recognized Sylvia, who was to her as a great lady, never having known Sylvia Robson in her wild, childish days. Widow Dobson was always a little scandalized at her brother Christopher's familiarity with Mrs. Hepburn. She dusted a chair which needed no dusting, and placed it for Sylvia, sitting down herself on a three-legged stool to mark her sense of the difference in their conditions, for there was another chair or two in the humble dwelling. And then the two fell into talk, first about Kester, whom his sister would persist in calling Christopher, as if his dignity as her elder brother was compromised by any familiar abbreviation, and by she opened her heart a little more. "I could wish as I'd learned right of hand," said she, "for I've that for to tell Christopher as might set his mind at ease. But you see, if I wrote him a letter he couldn't read it. So I just comfort myself with thinking nobody need learn writin' unless they'n got friends as can read. But I reckon he'd a been glad to hear as I've getten a lodger." Here she nodded her head in the direction of the door opening out of the house-place into the lean-to, which Sylvia had observed on drawing near the cottage, and the recollection of the mention of which by Kester had enabled her to identify widow Dobson's dwelling. "He's a bed yonder," the latter continued, dropping her voice. "He's a queer-looking tyke, but I don't think as he's a bad un." "When did he come?" said Sylvia, remembering Kester's account of his sister's character, and feeling as though it behoved her, as Kester's confidant on this head, to give cautious and prudent advice. "A matter of a sennight ago. I'm noan good at mindin' time. He's paid me his rent twice, but then he were keen to pay aforehand. He'd comed in one night and sate him down afore he could speak, he were so done up. He'd been on tramp this many a day, I reckon. 'Can you give me a bed?' says he, panting like after a bit. 'A chap as I met near here says as you've a lodging for to let.' 'Aye,' says I had that, but you mun pay me $1 a week for't.' Then my mind misgive me, for I thought he hadn't $1 into world, and yet if he hadn't, I should just have gi'n him to bed all to same. I'm not one as can turn a dog out if he comes to me wearied o' his life. So he outs wi' $1, and lays it down on to table, wi'out a word. 'I'll not trouble you long,' says he. 'I'm one as is best out o' to world,' he says. Then I thought as I'd been a bit hard upon him, and says I'm a widow woman, and one as has getten but few friends, for you see I were low about our Christopher's going away north. So I'm forced like to speak hard to folk. But I've made myself some stirabout for my supper, and if you'd like to share about with me, it's but putting a sup more water to it, and God's blessing'll be on it, just as same as if 'twere meal.' So he ups wi' his hand afore his een, and says not a word. At last he says, "Missus," says he, "can God's blessing be shared by a sinner, one o' t' devil's children," says he, "for the Scripture says he's to father o' lies." So I were puzzled like, and at length I says, "Thou mun ask t' parson that. I'm but a poor faint-hearted widow woman, but I've allays had God's blessing somehow, now I bethink me, and I'll share it with thee as far as my will goes." So he raxes his hand across t' table and mutters summat as he grips mine. I thought it were Scripture as he said, but I'd needed all my strength just then for to lift t' pot off t' fire, and it were t' first victual I'd tasted sin morn, for t' famine comes down like stones on t' head of us poor folk. And I said were just, "Coom along, chap, and fa too, and God's blessing be on him as eats most." And sin that day him and me's been as thick as thieves, only he's niver telled me naught of who he is or where he comes from. But I think he's one of them poor colliers as has getten brunt into coal pits, for to be sure his face is a' black with fire marks, and o' late days he's ta'en to his bed, and just lies there sighing, for one can hear him plain as dayleet through t' bit partition wa. As a proof of this, a sigh, almost a groan, startled the two women at this very moment. "Poor fellow," said Sylvia in a soft whisper, "there's more sore hearts in t' world than one reckons for." But after a while she bethought her again of Kester's account of his sister's softness, and she thought that it behoved her to give some good advice. So she added in a sterner, harder tone, "Still, you say you know naught about him, and tramps is tramps all t' world over, and you're a widow, and it behoves you to be careful. I think I'd just send him off as soon as he's a bit rested. You say he's plenty of money?" "No, I never said that. I know naught about it. He pays me aforehand, and he pays me down for whativer I've getten for him, but that's but little. He's noan up to his victual, though I've made him some broth as good as I could make 'em." "I wouldn't send him away till he was well again, if I were you, but I think you'd be better rid on him," said Sylvia. "It would be different if your brother were in Monkshaven." As she spoke, she rose to go. Widow Dobson held her hand in hers for a minute, then the humble woman said, "You'll noan be vexed with me, missus, if I cannot find in my heart to turn him out till he wants to go hissel? For I wouldn't like to vex you for Christopher's sake, but I know what it is for to feel for friendless folk, and choose what may come on it, I cannot send him away." "No," said Sylvia, "why should I be vexed? It's no business of mine, only I should send him away if I was you. He might go lodge where there was menfolk who know t' ways of tramps and are up to them." Into the sunshine went Sylvia. In the cold shadow the miserable tramp lay sighing. She did not know that she had been so near to him, towards whom her heart was softening day by day. End of chapter 43.